Well, as Ukraine appeals for more residents to flee the east of the country, our spotlight turns once again to the refugee crisis. It has become the largest exodus of refugees globally since World War II. The number of displaced Ukrainians has surged to more than 11 million. More than 4.3 million are living in neighbouring countries, while some countries have been strained by the influx. Most refugees have crossed into the European Union. Romania has taken in more than 600,000 people, and Hungary more than 400,000. Moldova, that's a country with just 2.6 million people, has also taken in more than 400,000 refugees from Ukraine. Well, that is nearly 15% of its population. Poland, though, bearing the brunt of the exodus, with more than 2.5 million people fleeing through it. It says it will spend $2.4 billion this year hosting the refugees, and this figure excludes education and healthcare costs. Poland is calling for more aid from the European Union. Some refugees are moving even further west. The United States says it has allowed nearly 3,000 Ukrainians into the country. More are gathering at the U.S. border, with Mexico awaiting entry. U.S. border officials were told to consider exempting Ukrainians from a policy that deports migrants, and that has led to claims of a double standard. For a greater understanding of the situation, Dawn is speaking to Professor Andrew Geddes. He is director at the Migration Policy Center in Italy.
Professor Geddes, there are reports that Europe, particularly Poland, Hungary as well, that Poland is increasingly becoming overwhelmed with this influx of refugees. How is the country coping, though, amid these concerns that services there are perhaps being stretched to the limit?
Well, I think that is the most pressing issue at the moment. As was just pointed out, the numbers of people moving is the highest since the Second World War. And inevitably, it's going to have implications for services, because what we also know, amongst those numbers, it is very strongly women and children who are moving. It requires housing, healthcare, education for children, and of course many people are also traumatized by their experiences and of course by their family separation. So the implications for services are extremely serious for countries which are not the richest member states of the European Union, typically.
That's right. But Poland, though, it is a big country and it has a large population of its own. How could the refugee influx from Ukraine, though, change the demographic makeup of Europe, though? It could possibly reshape things for things to come.
Well, if we focus on Poland specifically, 2.5 million Ukrainians have moved there, which was, of course, in terms of the scale, that is an enormous scale. And what we've seen is an amazing response by Polish families hosting Ukrainians. Now, in terms of the broader question about the implications for Europe's population, this is having big effects on neighbouring states. But the conflict itself is relatively recent, so we don't know what the longer-term effects are going to be on the European Union. So we know that around 4.3 million Ukrainians have moved. We know where they've gone to, typically to the neighbouring states. We expect people to then move on to other EU member states, because those are they can move on to other EU member states. And then that's going to have implications, population implications, with an influx of new people. And it brings us back to the first question about providing services for those people to ensure that they can build their new lives in another country.
In a sense, though, Professor Geddes, the European Union must have known, though, that this might be the case. I mean, after all, it was early in March that they gave Ukrainians temporary protection for harmonised access to rights in the EU. So they would have anticipated that there may have been greater demands on their resources, on schools, on education, on the ability for these people to live their lives. So is there a sense, though, that countries around the world who are accepting refugees from Ukraine, they're going to have to sort of thread this balance, to make this fine balance between domestic policy and offering this continued humanitarian assistance?
Yeah, I think that's precisely the political issue that's going to confront European countries and countries beyond Europe in the weeks, months, and possibly years to come, is is that the displacement is huge. It may continue, so that hundreds of thousands of more people may be displaced. And so that's going to pose important questions for countries all over the world, but particularly for European Union countries. Ukrainians did already have an agreement with the European Union that allows Ukrainians to move within the European labour market, within the European Union. And as you pointed out, the European Union, almost immediately after the conflict began, put in place a provision for what it calls temporary protection, which can last up to 3 years and gives Ukrainians essentially a refugee status and access to services in the member states of the European Union. But I suppose a lot of the answers to the questions that you raised will also depend upon the duration of this displacement, how long it lasts for. Are these people, in a way, permanently displaced? And because it's maybe a bit too early to know how this is going to play out in the longer term.
Well, let us hope that there is resolution to this situation soon. Professor Geddes, thank you very much for that. Professor Andrew Geddes, the Director of Migration Policy Centre.